The halls of St. Jude's Trauma Center were reserved for the elite Ivy League doctors and nurses with egos as big as their paychecks. When Sarah walked in, wearing scrubs that looked 2 sizes too big and a silence that unsettled the room, they didn't just ignore her. They laughed. They called her the mute, the maid, and the liability. They tried to force her out, but they didn't know who she really was. They didn't know that the scars on her arms weren't from clumsiness, but from shrapnel. They didn't know that their most high-value patient, a dying Navy SEAL commander, was holding on for one reason only. And it wasn't for the doctors. The laughter in the break room of Ward 4 West wasn't subtle. It was the sharp, jagged kind that was meant to be heard through the thin drywall. I asked her for a clamp, and she handed me a hemostat. Dr. Julian Thorne scoffed, leaning back in his leather chair. He was the golden boy of St. Jude's, a trauma surgeon whose Instagram following rivaled his surgical success rate. I swear HR is scraping the bottom of the barrel. She looks like she wandered in from a bus stop. She's 45 if she's a day. Nurse Jessica Thorne's head, surgical nurse, chimed in, stirring her oat milk latte. Who starts their residency or nursing rotation at 45, and have you seen her hands? They shake. I saw her trembling when she was prepping the IV tray for Mrs. Gable. Probably the DTs, Thorne muttered, checking his watch. Alcoholic or burned out. Either way, get her out of my OR. If she touches a patient during a critical procedure, I'm filing a formal complaint against administration. Outside the door, Sarah Mitchell adjusted the collar of her scrub top. It was blue standard issue, but on her it hung loosely, hiding a frame that was wiry and hardened. She had heard every word. She didn't blink. She didn't storm in to defend herself. She simply picked up the tray of sterilized instruments she had been carrying and walked toward the nurse's station. Sarah had been at St. Jude's for 3 weeks. In that time, she had spoken less than 100 words. She did the grunt work, changing bedpans, sanitizing surfaces, restocking carts, tasks that the younger, elite nurses felt were beneath them. She took the graveyard shifts nobody wanted. She took the ridicule. "Hey, newbie." Sarah paused. It was Greg, a second-year resident with a smirk permanently etched onto his face. He tossed a dirty lab coat at her. It landed on her shoulder. "Take that to laundry, and grab me a coffee, black. Don't mess it up like you did the charts." Sarah slowly peeled the coat off her shoulder. She looked at Greg. For a split second, her eyes, usually a dull, passive grey, flashed with something salt and metallic. It was the look of someone who had decided whether a man lived or died in the time it took to blink. Greg faltered his smirk, slipping for a fraction of a second. "Coffee," Sarah said softly. Her voice was raspy, like gravel moving over velvet. "Yeah. Coffee," Greg stammered, regaining his composure as she walked away. "Freak." The truth was, Sarah's hands did shake. But not from alcohol. They shook from the phantom vibrations of Black Hawk rotors. They shook because for 20 years her hands had been covered in the blood of boys who cried out for their mothers in the dirt of Kandahar Fallujah and places the government wouldn't admit existed. She wasn't just a new nurse. She was former Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell callsign, Angel, a specialized pararescue jumper and combat medic attached to Tier 1 Special Operations units. She had retired 3 years ago after an IED took out half her convoy and left her with a TBI traumatic brain injury and a spine full of titanium. She had come to St. Jude's not for the money, but because she needed the noise. The silence of retirement was too loud. She needed the beeping of monitors to sleep. She needed to be useful. But she had promised herself no heroics, no combat. Just quiet care. She was failing at the quiet part, mostly because Dr. Thorne and his clique were making her life a living hell. That afternoon, the hospital PA system crackled to life. The tone was different. 3 sharp blasts. Code Black. Trauma Bay 1. ETA, 3 minutes. Mass casualty event reported. High-value transfer incoming. The break room emptied instantly. Dr. Thorne was already barking orders as he sprinted down the hall. Jessica, prep or 1. Greg, get the blood bank on the line. This is it, people. We have VIPs coming in from the airfield. Sarah stood by the linen cart. She wasn't assigned to Trauma Bay 1. She was assigned to mop-up duty. But as the sirens wailed closer, a sound cut through the sterile air that made her blood freeze. It was the distinct rhythmic thumping of a heavy-lift military helicopter landing on the roof. Sarah dropped the mop. She knew that sound. That wasn't a medevac chopper. That was a PAVE Hawk. Something had gone wrong. Badly wrong. The trauma bay was chaos. The doors burst open, and paramedics, accompanied by 2 massive men in plain clothes wearing tactical headsets, wheeled in a stretcher. The patient was a mess of wires, blood-soaked gauze, and shattered bone. Male 40s, multiple gunshot wounds to the thoracic cavity. The lead paramedic shouted, his voice cracking. BP is 60/40 and dropping. We lost his pulse twice in the bird. Dr. Thorne stepped up, his ego swelling to fill the room. I've got this. Clear the way. Get a line in him. Type and cross-match for ONEG stat. The men in the tactical gear hovered aggressively. One of them, a bearded giant with a scar running down his neck, grabbed Thorne's scrub sleeve. Doc, the man growled. You listen to me. This is Commander Hayes. You lose him and there is no hole deep enough for you to hide in. Thorne yanked his arm away. Get these men out of my OR. I am trying to save a life here. Security ushered the operators out, but the tension remained thick enough to choke on. On the table, Commander Marcus Breaker Hayes was fading. The monitor screamed a flat, dissonant tone. He's coding! Nurse Jessica screamed. V, fib, paddles, Thorne yelled. Charge to 200. Thump. Nothing. Charge to 300. Thump. Come on. Thorne was sweating now. The confident surgeon was cracking. The damage was too extensive. There was arterial spray hitting the floor every time they did compressions. Where is the bleeder? I can't see anything through this mess. In the corner of the room, unnoticed, Sarah Mitchell had slipped in. She wasn't supposed to be there. She was supposed to be cleaning the waiting room. But she was watching the monitor, and she was watching the blood flow. She saw what Thorne missed. Thorne was looking at the chest wounds. But the blood wasn't pooling in the chest cavity alone. The commander's abdomen was distended tight as a drum. He's got a junctional hemorrhage, Sarah whispered. No one heard her. I said charge to 360, Thorne screamed. We are losing him. Sarah moved. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was muscle memory. She stepped past Greg, who tried to block her. Get out of here, janitor, Greg hissed. Sarah shoved him. It wasn't a gentle push. She drove her shoulder into his sternum with enough force to knock the breath out of him, sending him stumbling into a cart. Hey! Thorne looked up, eyes wide with rage. What the hell are you doing, security? Sarah ignored him. She reached the table. She didn't look at Thorne. She looked at the wound on the commander's upper thigh, high up near the groin, hidden by the shredded tactical pants. It was a femoral artery, nick bleeding internally disguised by the chest trauma. "He's bleeding out from the femoral," Sarah said, her voice commanding, dropping an octave into her command voice, the voice that had directed fire teams under mortar attack. "Stop compressions. You're pumping the blood out of him." "You are fired," Thorne roared. "Get away from the patient." Sarah didn't flinch. She jammed her fist, literally, her entire gloved fist deep into the open wound on the commander's groin. It was a brutal, archaic maneuver. The room went silent. "I said stop compressions." Sarah stared Thorne dead in the eyes. "Look at the monitor." Thorne looked. The blood pressure, which had been flatlining, gave a small, weak blip. Then another. The massive arterial spray that had been coating the floor slowed to a trickle. By applying direct manual pressure to the artery against the pelvic bone, she had crimped the hose. He stabilized, Jessica whispered, staring at the screen. Sarah didn't smile. She was sweating, her face pale, her hands shaking slightly from the exertion, but her grip was iron. "Clamp," Sarah said. She didn't ask. She ordered. Thorne stood frozen. His brain couldn't process what was happening. The janitor nurse, the one he mocked for trembling hands, was currently elbow-deep in a Navy SEAL, holding his life together with sheer brute force. "I said give me a damn vascular clamp, doctor," Sarah barked. Thorne snapped out of it. He grabbed the instrument and handed it to her. With a dexterity that belied her earlier shaking, Sarah navigated the blood-slicked cavity, found the torn artery, and clamped it blind. She slowly withdrew her hand. The monitor held steady. "Now," Sarah said, peeling off her blood-soaked gloves and tossing them into the bin. "You can treat the chest wounds. He won't bleed out while you do it." She turned to walk away. "Wait," Thorne stammered. "How did you... Who are you?" Sarah paused at the door. The adrenaline was fading, and the familiar ache in her spine was returning. She looked at the floor. "Just the new nurse," she said quietly. She walked out. But as she left, the doors to the trauma bay swung open again. The two operators from before the one's security had kicked out were standing there. They had seen the last 30 seconds through the observation glass. The giant with the beard stared at Sarah as she walked past. His eyes went wide. He looked at her face, then at the way she walked, favoring her left leg slightly. "Angel," the operator whispered. Sarah didn't stop. She kept walking until she reached the locker room, where she sat on a bench and buried her face in her hands. She had broken cover. She had broken protocol. And she had definitely just gotten herself fired. Inside the trauma bay, Commander Hayes's vitals were stabilizing. But the drama was far from over. Thorne was already spinning the narrative in his head. I saved him. I directed the nurse. It was my team. He had no idea that the man on the table was waking up, and he certainly had no idea that Commander Hayes owed Sarah Mitchell a debt that couldn't be paid with money. The adrenaline had long since evaporated, leaving Dr. Julian Thorne with a calculated coolness. He stood in the office of Hospital Administrator Marcus Sterling, a man whose concern for the hospital's endowment fund far outweighed his concern for patient care. "She assaulted a resident, Marcus," Thorne said, smoothing his pristine white coat. "She physically shoved Dr. Greg Evans, and then she shoved her unwashed hands into a sterile surgical cavity. It's a miracle Commander Hayes didn't go into septic shock immediately. I had to intervene, repair the damage she caused, and stabilize the patient myself." Administrator Sterling tapped his pen on the mahogany desk. But the patient is alive, because of me. Thorne lied without blinking. I guided the team. She was a disruption. A dangerous, unhinged disruption. I want her license revoked, and I want her gone. If the Navy finds out a geriatric, shaky-handed nurse was manhandling a SEAL commander, we'll lose the military contract. Sterling nodded slowly. You're right. We can't risk the liability. Draft the termination papers. I'll have security escort her out before the shift change. While the administration plotted her demise, Sarah was down in the sterilization room scrubbing instruments. The water was scalding hot, turning her hands raw and red, but she didn't feel it. She was lost in a memory, a dust storm in the Arghandab Valley. The smell of burning diesel and the weight of a dying boy in her arms. She knew she was done. She knew Thorne would spin it. In the civilian world, results didn't matter as much as protocol. In her old life, if you saved the hostage, you were a hero. Here, if you saved the patient, but didn't fill out the right form, you were a liability. Up in the ICU, the atmosphere was heavy. Commander Marcus Breaker Hayes was awake, though heavily sedated. He was a man carved from granite, with eyes that had seen too much darkness to ever truly close. His team, the operators who had brought him in, were standing guard. They refused to leave the room, despite the nurse's protests. "Unit integrity!" The bearded giant, whom the others called Dutch, growled at a terrified nurse. "We don't break it." Dr. Thorne breezed into the room, a practiced smile plastered on his face. He held a clipboard. "Gentlemen." Thorne nodded to the operators, then turned to the bed. "Commander, good to see you with us. That was a close call. Touch and go, but I managed to clamp the femoral just in time. You're a lucky man." Hayes blinked, his vision clearing. He looked at Thorne. He looked at the surgeon's soft, manicured hands. "You," Hayes rasped. His voice sounded like grinding stones. "Yes," Thorne beamed. "I'm Dr. Thorne, Chief of Trauma Surgery. I led the team." Hayes frowned. The memory was fragmented flashes of white light and searing pain. But he remembered a sensation. A grip. It hadn't been the tentative, probing touch of a surgeon afraid to break something. It had been a violent, decisive intrusion that hurt like hell, but stopped the cold feeling of death spreading in his legs. And he remembered a voice. Not this man's smooth baritone. A woman's voice. Raspy. Smoky. Commanding. "There was a woman," Hayes whispered. Thorne's smile didn't waver, but his eyes tightened. "Ah, yes, the nurses. They were assisting me. Standard procedure." "No," Hayes said, struggling to sit up before the pain forced him back. "Not a nurse. A soldier." Thorne laughed lightly, a condescending sound. "The anesthesia plays tricks on the mind, Commander. There are no soldiers on my medical staff, just highly trained doctors. Now rest. You need your strength." Thorne turned to leave, signaling the nurses to increase the sedative. But as he walked past, Dutch, the giant operator, stepped into his path. Dutch was 6'5" and built like a tank. "Doc," Dutch said. "Yes." Thorne looked annoyed. Who was the woman with the grey eyes, the one who walked out? Thorne scoffed. "A nobody. A temp nurse. She's being terminated as we speak for incompetence. Don't worry, she won't be anywhere near the commander again." Thorne walked out, feeling triumphant. Dutch watched him go. Then he looked back at Hayes. The commander's eyes were open, and the fog was clearing. "Dutch," Hayes whispered. "I'm here, boss." "He's lying," Hayes said. "Find her." Sarah sat in the small, windowless office of Human Resources. Across from her sat a woman named Karen, who looked more bored than angry. "Ms. Mitchell." Karen sighed, sliding a piece of paper across the desk. "Dr. Thorne has filed a formal incident report. Insubordination. Physical assault on a resident, and practicing outside the scope of your nursing license. We have no choice but to terminate your employment, effective immediately." Sarah looked at the paper. Termination. She didn't argue. She didn't explain that Thorne had been freezing up or that the resident had been in the way. She simply nodded. "Okay," Sarah said softly. "Please hand over your badge," Karen said. Sarah unclipped the plastic ID from her scrub top and placed it on the desk. It felt lighter. "You have 20 minutes to clear out your locker. Security will escort you to the exit." Sarah stood up. Her back ached. The old shrapnel wound in her hip was throbbing a reminder that it was going to rain soon. She walked out of the office, flanked by 2 security guards, who looked at her like she was a criminal. They marched her through the main hallway. It was the shift change. The hallway was crowded with doctors, nurses, and residents. They all stopped to watch. News travels fast in a hospital. Everyone knew. The weird mute nurse had finally snapped and gotten fired. "Good riddance," Greg, the resident she had shoved, sneered as she passed. He was holding an ice pack to his chest. "Hope you enjoy flipping burgers." Nurse Jessica was there too, shaking her head. "I told you she wasn't cut out for this. Too unstable." Sarah kept her eyes forward. She carried a small cardboard box containing a stethoscope, a spare pair of socks, and a framed photo of a dog that had passed away years ago. That was it. That was her whole life at St. Jude's. She reached the lobby. The automatic doors were just ahead. Freedom. Silence. "Hold it." The shout was so loud it rattled the glass in the reception booth. The security guard stopped. Sarah stopped. Down the long corridor coming from the elevators was a phalanx of men. It was Dutch and 3 other operators. They weren't walking. They were moving with a purpose that made the doctors and visitors scramble out of the way. Dutch spotted Sarah. He pointed a finger at her. "You," Dutch bellowed. "Don't move." The security guards put their hands on their belts. They didn't carry guns, just tasers. "Sir, you can't be down here. This is a restricted—" Dutch didn't even look at the guard. He just kept walking until he was standing 2 feet from Sarah. He towered over her. The hallway went dead silent. Everyone was watching. Was she in trouble? Had she hurt the patient? Was this the military police coming to arrest her? Greg smirked. "Oh, this is going to be good. They're going to arrest her." Dutch looked down at Sarah. He looked at the cardboard box in her hands. Then he looked at her face, studying the scar above her eyebrow, the grey eyes, the way she stood with her weight distributed evenly, ready to move. "Ma'am," Dutch said, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man of his size. "Commander Hayes is asking for you." Sarah tightened her grip on the box. "I don't work here anymore. I was just fired." Dutch's head snapped up. He looked around the lobby, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Dr. Thorne, who had just come down to enjoy the show. "Fired." Dutch repeated the word, heavy with menace. "She nearly killed the patient," Thorne shouted from the back, trying to regain control of the narrative. "She is a danger to this hospital. Officers, remove her." Dutch turned his body slowly toward Thorne. The other 3 operators fanned out, creating a protective perimeter around Sarah. It was a subtle tactical move, diamond formation used, to protect a VIP. Nearly killed him, Dutch asked, his voice low. That man up there is alive because someone knew how to crimp a femoral artery without seeing it. And I know for a fact, Doctor, that it wasn't you. I saw the security footage from the bay. A gasp went through the lobby. That's confidential property. Thorne sputtered, his face turning red. It's evidence, Dutch corrected. And I saw a woman with a distinct limp and a left-handed clamp technique save my CO's life while you were screaming for electricity. Dutch turned back to Sarah. He saw the way she was looking at the floor, trying to disappear. He saw the shame she shouldn't be feeling. We checked your file, ma'am, Dutch said softly, so only she could hear. Or the file you gave HR. Sarah Mitchell, associate's degree in nursing, previous experience nursing home. Sarah didn't look up. But then I made a call to a friend at the Pentagon, Dutch continued. I gave him your vitals and your description, and he told me there is no Sarah Mitchell. Sarah's eyes snapped to his. He told me. Dutch smiled, a sad, respectful smile, that there is a Jane Doe, retired from the 24th Special Tactics Squadron, call sign Angel. The only woman to ever complete the PJ pipeline and serve with the teams off the books, credited with 400 combat saves. The box slipped from Sarah's hands. It hit the floor with a thud. The whisper ran through the crowd. Special Tactics. 400 saves. Thorne pushed his way to the front. I don't care if she's Florence Nightingale. She broke protocol. She is fired. She isn't going anywhere, a voice boomed from the elevators. The crowd parted. A wheelchair was being pushed forward by a terrified nurse. In it sat Commander Hayes. He was pale, hooked up to a portable IV and a monitor, and he looked like death warmed over. But he was sitting upright. Commander, you cannot be out of bed, Thorne shrieked. Hayes ignored him. He looked across the lobby at Sarah. Their eyes locked. For the first time in years, Sarah felt seen. Not as a janitor, not as a screw-up, but as who she was. Hayes raised a trembling hand. He didn't point. He slowly, painfully brought his hand up to his brow. He saluted her. Dutch and the 3 other operators snapped to attention. Their boots slammed into the linoleum floor in unison. Crack. They raised their hands in a sharp, crisp salute. The silence in the lobby was deafening. Lieutenant, Hayes rasped, using her old rank. I believe you have my life in your hands. Again. Sarah's lip trembled. She fought it, but a single tear tracked through the dust on her cheek. She slowly straightened her posture. The slouch of the tired nurse vanished. Her shoulders squared, her chin rose. She returned the salute. Commander, she whispered. Thorne looked around, realizing the tide had turned violently against him. This is ridiculous. This is a hospital, not a parade ground. Security. Shut up, Administrator Sterling said. He had appeared on the balcony overlooking the lobby. He had been watching the whole thing. He looked down at Thorne. Shut up, Julian. Sterling walked down the stairs. He approached Sarah. He looked at the operators, then at the commander, and finally at the new nurse he had just ordered fired. Ms. Mitchell, Sterling said, his voice shaking slightly. It seems there has been a significant misunderstanding regarding your employment status. No misunderstanding, Sarah said, her voice regaining that steel from the trauma bay. She looked at Thorne. I quit. No, Hayes said from the wheelchair. You don't. He rolled his wheelchair forward until he was right in front of her. I have a mission for you, Angel, Hayes said, and it pays better than this place. But before Sarah could answer, the hospital doors blew open again. But this time, it wasn't a patient.